there's a specific moment when everything changes. You've been doing the work. For months, maybe years, you've been setting boundaries, reclaiming your energy, finding your voice again. You've stopped checking your phone obsessively. You've stopped replaying conversations in your mind, wondering what you did wrong. You've stopped shrinking yourself to make someone else comfortable. And then, they come back. Maybe it's a text message after months of silence. Maybe it's a coincidental run-in at a place they know you frequent. Maybe it's a sudden crisis that only you can help them solve. Whatever form it takes, the timing is never random. It always happens just when you thought you were finally free. Just when you finally felt strong. This is the moment I want to talk about today. Because what happens next is one of the most devastating psychological manipulations you'll ever encounter. And if you don't recognize it for what it is, it can undo years of healing in a matter of weeks. Carl Jung, the founder of analytical psychology, discovered something profound about this exact dynamic. He understood that certain people operate from what he called an inflated ego, a psychological structure built on control and domination rather than authentic selfhood. And he recognized that these individuals have an unconscious radar for when their targets are healing, when their victims are becoming whole. Because here's what most people don't understand. Narcissists don't fear your anger. They don't fear your boundaries, at least not in the way you might think. What they truly fear is your wholeness, your completeness, your psychological sovereignty. Before we dive deeper, if this resonates with your soul's journey, please hit that like button and subscribe for more transformational content. Your support helps this message reach other souls who need to hear it. When you were weak, confused, seeking their approval, you served their purpose perfectly. You were what Jung might have called their psychological supply, a source of energy validation and control. But the moment you stop seeking their approval and start trusting your own instincts, the moment you reconnect with your own inner authority, you become a threat to their entire identity structure. And that's when they deploy the weapon Jung warned us about. That's when they pull out their final, most devastating trick. Over the next 50 minutes, I'm going to walk you through the psychological mechanism behind this final manipulation. We're going to look at it through Carl Jung's lens of shadow work projection and individuation. We're going to understand why this is happening to you, not because of you. And by the end, you'll have a complete framework for true healing that honors your empathy without sacrifice. This isn't pop psychology. This is depth psychology meeting modern neuroscience. This is Carl Jung empath and personal development wisdom that can change your life if you let it penetrate deeply enough. So if you've ever felt that pull, that magnetic draw back towards someone you know isn't good for you, if you've ever questioned whether you're being too harsh, too cold, too selfish, if you've ever wondered why your healing seems to trigger their crisis, then what I'm about to share will finally make sense of that confusion. Let's begin. To understand this final manipulation, we first need to understand the fundamental dynamic between narcissists and empaths through a Jungian framework. Because this isn't just about two personality types. This is about two completely different ways of organizing psychological reality. Carl Jung taught that every human being carries what he called a shadow, the parts of ourselves that we cannot accept, the qualities we've rejected or disowned. For most of us, shadow work is a gradual, difficult process of integration. We slowly learn to acknowledge our anger, our selfishness, our weakness, our darkness. We bring these rejected parts into consciousness and integrate them into a more complete sense of self. But narcissists have a fundamentally different relationship with their shadow. They carry a massive, unintegrated shadow containing their deepest shame, their worthlessness, their terror of insignificance. And rather than doing the painful work of integration, they use a defense mechanism Jung identified as projection. They project their shadow outward onto other people. This is where empaths enter the picture. Empaths, people with highly developed feeling functions, deep sensitivity, strong intuition become ideal containers for the narcissist's projected shadow. Without even realizing it, you began carrying emotions that didn't originate in you. You've been feeling their pain more acutely than they seem to feel it themselves. You've been holding their shame, their vulnerability, their rejected humanity. Think about it. Have you ever felt responsible for their emotional state? Have you ever absorbed their anger and turned it into anxiety? Have you ever felt their emptiness as if it were your own? That's not your imagination. That's projection in action. You became the repository for everything they couldn't face in themselves. Now here's the crucial part that most therapeutic approaches miss. This dynamic serves both parties on an unconscious level. The narcissist externalizes their shadow and maintains their inflated ego. But what does the empath get? For many empaths, this dynamic feels strangely familiar because it recreates a childhood pattern. Perhaps you grew up as an emotional caretaker. Perhaps you learned very early that your value came from attuning to others' needs before your own. Perhaps you developed hypervigilance around other people's emotional states as a survival mechanism. Carl Jung, empath and personal development work requires us to acknowledge this truth without shame. Your empathy is beautiful and profound, as it may have originated in a wound. That doesn't make it less valuable. But it means your empathy has been operating unconsciously, automatically, without boundaries or discernment. You have what Jung would call a highly developed feeling function and the psychological function that allows you to perceive emotional truths, to sense what's unspoken, to feel the undercurrents in any interaction. This is an extraordinary gift. But when the feeling function develops without a corresponding development of boundaries, without a strong connection to your own center, it becomes a trap. The narcissist unconsciously recognizes this. They're drawn to empaths not for love, but for supply. Not for connection, but for control. Your sensitivity becomes their feeding ground. Your compassion becomes their weapon. And this arrangement can continue for years, even decades, until something shifts. That something is what Jung called individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are. Individuation is the central task of human psychological development. It's the journey from unconscious identification with others toward conscious selfhood. It's the movement from living according to external expectations toward living from your authentic core. When you begin individuating, when you start setting boundaries and trusting your own perceptions, something terrifying happens in the narcissist's psyche. Because you're no longer available as a container for their shadow, you're no longer serving as their psychological supply, you're no longer feeding the system that keeps their inflated ego intact. Jung described a principle called enantiodromia, the tendency of things to convert into their opposite when pushed to an extreme. When the narcissist realizes they're losing control, you'll often see this principle in action. Their idealization of you flips suddenly to devaluation, or their pattern of abandonment flips suddenly to desperate pursuit. This isn't inconsistency. This is enantiodromia. They're experiencing what we might call a power inversion crisis. For years, the power dynamic flowed in one direction. They held the power through criticism, through withdrawal, through keeping you off balance. But now something has shifted. You've reconnected to your own inner wellspring. You're no longer leaking energy outward in a desperate attempt to fix, heal, or save them. You've stopped carrying their shadow, and they can feel it. Jung spoke of certain individuals as engaging in what we might call psychological vampirism. They drain others' psychic energy because they're disconnected from their own inner source. This isn't metaphorical. You've probably felt the exhaustion after spending time with them. You felt the depletion, the confusion, the sense that something vital has been extracted from you. But when you individuate, when you do your own shadow work and reconnect with yourself, Jung's term for the central organizing principle of the psyche, you're no longer available for that extraction. You've sealed the leak. You've reclaimed your energy. And this is precisely what triggers their final, desperate manipulation. Because here's what they fear more than anything. They don't fear your anger or your boundaries or even your absence. What they fear is your wholeness, your completeness, your psychological sovereignty. Because your wholeness reminds them of their own potential for growth, potential they've abandoned in favor of control and manipulation. When you refuse to shrink yourself to make them comfortable, you're not just setting a boundary. You're holding up a mirror to what they could become if they did their own work. And that mirror is unbearable to them. So they deploy one final devastating manipulation that targets your healing itself. They launch what Jung might have described as a final assault on your individuation process. And it comes in 3 distinct phases. Phase 1, strength shaming. Remember how they used to criticize your weaknesses. Remember how they pointed out your insecurities, your flaws, your shortcomings. You probably spent years trying to fix those things, trying to become good enough, strong enough, worthy enough. But now watch what happens when you've actually healed those weaknesses. Now they flip the script entirely. Your boundaries become coldness. Your voice becomes aggression. Your confidence becomes arrogance. Your self-care becomes selfishness. Your growth becomes superiority. If you learn to say no, they'll say, "You've become so cold and uncaring." If you found your voice, they'll say, "You're so harsh now, so aggressive." If you prioritized yourself, they'll say, "Success has really gone to your head." If you set limits, they'll say, "You think you're better than everyone now." This isn't random criticism. This is surgical, targeted psychological warfare. They're specifically attacking the parts of yourself that you're most proud of healing. They're making you ashamed of the very qualities that set you free. Jung understood this mechanism deeply. When someone is invested in your smallness, your growth becomes their threat. When someone has built their identity on being needed by you, your independence becomes their crisis. When someone has maintained control through your self-doubt, your certainty becomes their enemy. Strength shaming works because it activates your deepest fear that maybe you have changed for the worse. Maybe you have become too hard. Maybe the old you was better, kinder, more loving, more connected. And here's what makes this so insidious: part of you starts to believe it. Because you're an empath. Because you do care about being a good person. Because you don't want to be cold or harsh or selfish. So you start second-guessing yourself. You start wondering if your boundaries are too rigid. You start questioning whether your healing has made you less loving. But let me offer you a different frame through Jung's psychology. What if your so-called coldness is actually discernment? What if your selfishness is actually self-preservation? What if your harshness is actually honesty? What if your superiority is actually healthy self-esteem? The narcissist cannot distinguish between these because they've never done their own shadow work. To them, any boundary feels like rejection. Any self-prioritization feels like abandonment. Any confidence feels like threat. But you're not responsible for their inability to tolerate your wholeness. Jung said that we must hold the tension of opposites, what he called the transcendent function. You can be both compassionate and boundaried. You can be both caring and self-protecting. You can be both open-hearted and discerning. Strength shaming tries to force you to choose. It tries to convince you that you can either be loving or be strong, but not both. And that's a lie designed to pull you back into the old dynamic where your love required your weakness. But when strength shaming doesn't work, they move to phase 2. Phase 2, nostalgic manipulation. Remember when you used to laugh at my jokes? You were so much happier before you started all this therapy. I miss the person you used to be. We had such a good connection before you changed. You're not the same person I fell in love with. Carl Jung might have called this psychological time travel, an attempt to pull you back into an earlier version of yourself. And it's devastatingly effective because it plays on a very real grief that many empaths experience during their healing journey. There is a mourning that happens when you individuate. You are leaving behind an identity that, while painful, was familiar. The old you fit more easily into relationships, even dysfunctional ones. The old you didn't disappoint people. The old you was needed, valued, appreciated for your caretaking. The old you was also slowly dying inside. But the narcissist won't mention that part. They paint a romantic picture of the past. They remind you of good moments, peak experiences, times when you felt connected and loved. And they conveniently forget the context, the times you cried yourself to sleep, the times you felt invisible, the times you sacrificed your own needs to keep the peace. Nostalgic manipulation is particularly dangerous because it doesn't feel like manipulation. It feels like longing. It feels like maybe they really do see you, really do miss, you really do want connection. But here's the truth. Jung would want you to understand they're not missing the real you. They're missing the controllable you. The person they're reminiscing about wasn't more authentic. She was more accessible to their manipulation. The person they claimed to love wasn't more lovable. She was more willing to abandon herself for their comfort. When they say, "I miss the old you," what they're really saying is, "I miss the version of you that didn't threaten my ego." When they say, "You've changed," what they mean is, "You've stopped playing your role in my psychological drama." Jung understood that individuation, becoming who you truly are, requires betraying who others needed you to be. This is not cruelty. This is necessity. You cannot become yourself while remaining everyone else's projection screen. The old you wasn't happier. She was more compliant. There's a difference. The old you didn't have better relationships. She had more accommodating ones. There's a difference. The old you wasn't more loving. She was more self-abandoning. And that's a crucial difference. So when they deploy nostalgic manipulation, when they try to make you homesick for a version of yourself that was more convenient for them, remember this: you're not leaving your authentic self behind. You're finally meeting her for the first time. But if both strength shaming and nostalgic manipulation fail, if you remain firm in your boundaries and clear in your worth, the narcissist has one final weapon. And this is the one that brings even the strongest empaths to their knees. Phase 3. Manufactured vulnerability. This is the dirty trick Jung would have found most psychologically fascinating and most ethically disturbing. Just when you're at your strongest, just when you've created solid boundaries, just when you've reclaimed your energy and your life, suddenly they're in crisis. A health scare, a financial emergency, a family tragedy, a mental breakdown, an addiction relapse, a suicidal episode. And the timing is never coincidental. Carl Jung understood that narcissists maintain detailed mental maps of your compassion triggers. Through years of close observation, they've learned exactly what makes you feel guilty, what activates your caretaker instincts, what causes you to abandon your boundaries. If you have a history of losing loved ones, they'll have a health crisis. If you have financial anxiety, they'll have monetary troubles. If you're particularly triggered by mental health struggles, they'll have an emotional breakdown. If you've experienced suicide in your family, they'll hint at self-harm. They know your soft spots, and they weaponize your empathy against your healing. Now here's the part that will make you question everything you thought you knew about them. Jung observed that certain individuals will actually create the very crises they're asking you to solve. They'll sabotage their own relationships, their work, their health, their stability. Anything to create a situation where you feel obligated to step in and save them. This serves two purposes in their psychological economy. First, it pulls you back into the caretaker role, reestablishing the old dynamic. Second, it proves to them that they still have power over you, that your healing hasn't actually freed you. But here's what makes manufactured vulnerability the most dangerous manipulation. The crisis might be real. The pain might be genuine. The need might be legitimate. And that's precisely why it works so well on empaths. Because you're not heartless. You're not cruel. You do care about human suffering. Your compassion is real and profound. So when they come to you vulnerable, hurting, desperate, everything in you wants to help. This is where Carl Jung, empath, and personal development wisdom becomes absolutely critical. Because the question isn't whether their crisis is real. The question is whether you're the appropriate person to solve it. Jung spoke of what we might call differentiated compassion. You can feel empathy for someone's struggles without feeling responsible for solving them. You can witness pain without owning it. You can care about someone's well-being without sacrificing your own. But manufactured vulnerability specifically targets your inability to distinguish between empathy and responsibility. Notice the language they use when they come to you in crisis. I know you don't usually lend money, but this is different. I know you said you needed space, but I really need you right now. I know you're trying to focus on yourself, but couldn't you just help me this once? I know you don't usually, but is designed to acknowledge your boundary while simultaneously asking you to violate it. Every just this once is designed to make you feel like your boundary is the unreasonable element in this situation. And here's the psychological manipulation embedded in that language. It makes you feel like you're the one being inflexible, unloving, or cruel if you maintain your boundary in the face of their crisis. But Jung would ask you to consider this. Do they have other people they could call? Do they have other resources they could access? Have they actually tried every other option? Or did they come to you first because they knew you were the most likely to sacrifice your boundaries? The truth is, they often have entire support networks. But they come to you specifically because you're the one who's been trained, conditioned, manipulated into believing that your boundaries are less important than their needs. And notice what they're asking you to compromise. It's never something neutral. They're specifically requesting that you violate the very boundaries and values you've worked hardest to establish. If you've been working on financial boundaries, they need money. If you've been protecting your time and energy, they need you to drop everything. If you've been limiting contact, they need immediate access. If you've been building your own life, they need you to put it on hold. Every just this once is a test. Will you choose them or yourself? Will you prove your healing was real? Or will you demonstrate that they can still control you through your compassion? And here's what Jung understood that most people miss. If you compromise your boundaries once in the face of manufactured vulnerability, you've just taught them that vulnerability is the key to controlling you. You've shown them that when logic doesn't work, when anger doesn't work, when guilt doesn't work, all they need to do is appear helpless. And they'll use that key again, and again, and again. Because every time you abandon yourself to rescue them, you're not just helping them through a crisis. You're reinforcing the neural pathways of self-abandonment that you've been working so hard to rewire. So how do you navigate this? How do you maintain your compassion without sacrificing your sovereignty? How do you honor your empathy while protecting your healing? This is where Jung's concept of individuation becomes not just theoretical, but practical. This is where Carl Jung, empath, and personal development principles give us a concrete path forward. Carl Jung gave us a profound framework for navigating this terrain, and it starts with understanding what he meant by the word self. In Jungian psychology, the self with a capital S is the central organizing principle of your psyche. It's not your ego, not your persona, not the roles you play. It's the deepest, truest core of who you are. And individuation is the lifelong process of coming into relationship with that self. When you operate from ego alone, you're reactive. You're controlled by external expectations and internal complexes. You're blown about by other people's needs and opinions. But when you operate from self, you have a center. You have an inner authority that guides your choices. This is where differentiated compassion emerges. Differentiated compassion means you can feel empathy for someone's struggles without feeling responsible for solving them. You can witness pain without owning it. You can care deeply about someone's well-being without sacrificing your own. Jung said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." When a narcissist comes to you in crisis, when they deploy that manufactured vulnerability, you must ask yourself this question: is helping them helping me become who I truly am? Or is it preventing me from that journey? This isn't selfishness. This is discernment. If helping them requires you to violate your own boundaries, to abandon your own needs, to betray your own values, then helping them is actually participating in a dynamic that harms both of you. It harms you by reinforcing self-abandonment. It harms them by enabling continued manipulation. True compassion sometimes looks like holding a boundary. True love sometimes looks like letting someone experience the consequences of their own choices. True empathy sometimes means saying, "I see your pain, and I trust you to find your own way through it." But to practice differentiated compassion, you need to do your own shadow work. Because empaths have shadows too. Your shadow likely contains qualities you've rejected because they conflict with your identity as a good person. Healthy selfishness, righteous anger, the capacity to disappoint others, the ability to witness suffering without rescuing the permission to prioritize yourself. Jung taught that these rejected qualities don't disappear. They go into the unconscious, where they either get projected onto others or they sabotage us from within. Many empaths have projected their healthy selfishness onto narcissists, seeing them as so selfish, while remaining unable to access healthy self-interest themselves. The integration work is to reclaim these qualities consciously and choose when and how to express them. Jung developed a technique called active imagination, a method of dialoguing with different parts of yourself. Here's how you might use it. Write a conversation between your compassionate self, the part that wants to help them, that feels their pain, that's pulled toward rescue, and your sovereign self, the part that knows your worth, that protects your boundaries, that prioritizes your healing. Don't suppress the compassionate impulse. Listen to it. Let it speak fully. What is it afraid will happen if you don't help? What does it believe about who you are if you maintain your boundary? Then let your sovereign self respond, not to argue or defeat, but to bring wisdom. What does this part know about the larger pattern? What does it see that compassionate self might be missing? This isn't about choosing between them. This is about integration, allowing both voices to inform a more complete response. You might discover that your compassionate self is actually your wounded inner child who learned that love requires self-sacrifice. You might discover that your sovereign self is your individuated adult who knows that real love includes self-love. The integration looks like this. I feel compassion for your struggle, and I trust you to handle it. I care about your well-being, and I'm not responsible for your choices. I can empathize with your pain, and I can maintain my boundary. This is holding the tension of opposites, what Jung called the transcendent function. You're not collapsing into either extreme. You're holding both truths simultaneously. But here's what we need to acknowledge. When they deploy that final manipulation, especially manufactured vulnerability, your body responds before your mind can catch up. Jung understood the mind-body connection long before modern neuroscience validated it. And now we know exactly what happens in your nervous system when you encounter a trauma trigger. When you see their message, when you hear about their crisis. When they show up vulnerable and hurting, your cortisol spikes, stress response activated. Your amygdala sounds the alarm threat detected. If they're love bombing, your dopamine surges, reward system remembers the highs. If they're appearing vulnerable, your oxytocin floods, bonding hormone activates. Your prefrontal cortex goes offline, rational thinking becomes difficult. Your body is literally hijacked. And this isn't weakness. This is neurobiology shaped by repeated patterns. You've been conditioned through intermittent reinforcement, the most powerful form of behavioral conditioning that exists. Unpredictable patterns of warmth and coldness, availability and abandonment have created neural pathways that fire automatically when you encounter certain triggers. So the healing work isn't just psychological, it's also somatic, it's in your body. Here are 3 practices rooted in both Jungian depth work and modern trauma neuroscience. First, bilateral stimulation. When you feel the pull when your body starts to respond, try this. Alternate tapping your knees while breathing deeply. Left knee, right knee, left knee, right knee. This bilateral movement helps your brain process trauma memories and can reduce the intensity of emotional flooding. Second, boundary breathing. This combines visualization with breath work. Inhale while imagining roots growing from your feet deep into the earth, grounding and stabilizing you. Exhale while imagining a protective boundary around your body, not a wall that blocks connection, but a membrane that allows you to feel without absorbing. Third, vagal toning. Your vagus nerve is the key to shifting from sympathetic activation, fight, flight, freeze to ventral vagal safety. And you can tone it through humming, singing, or even gargling. These activities literally stimulate the nerve that tells your body you're safe. These aren't woo-woo practices. This is neuroscience meeting Jungian wisdom. This is working with your body's innate healing capacity. Jung emphasized what he called the transcendent function and the capacity to hold tension between opposites without collapsing into either extreme. Here's a practice that embodies this principle. When you feel pulled back toward them, when the manufactured crisis is triggering your caretaking instincts, create 2 columns on a piece of paper. Column 1, what I feel, emotional reality column. 2, what I know, integrated wisdom. For example, what I feel guilty for setting boundaries. What I know boundaries are self-respect, not selfishness. What I feel their pain intensely. What I know I cannot heal what I didn't break. What I feel pulled to help them. What I know helping maintains the dysfunction. What I feel like I'm being cold by staying away. What I know I'm being wise by protecting my peace. This practice isn't about dismissing your feelings. Your feelings are real and valid, but feelings aren't always accurate guides to action. By holding both your emotional truth and your integrated wisdom simultaneously, you activate the transcendent function. You create space between stimulus and response. You give yourself choice, because inevitably, as part of their manufactured vulnerability, they'll promise transformation. They'll say they've changed, they're in therapy. They finally understand they're ready to do the work. And you need clear criteria for distinguishing authentic change from manipulative performance. Authentic transformation looks like this: sustained therapeutic work, not just announced, but demonstrated over 12 months or more. You see evidence, not just hear promises. Full accountability but you also deflections. They own their behavior completely without trying to make their actions your responsibility. Respecting your boundaries even when it's uncomfortable for them. They honor your no without punishing you for it. Demonstrating change through patterns, not just words or grand gestures. You see consistent different behavior over time, not requiring your presence to do their healing work. They're doing it for themselves regardless of whether you're watching, making amends through actions, not explanations. They show you who they've become. They don't just tell you. Manipulation disguised as transformation looks like this: dramatic announcements without sustained follow-through. Big declarations, minimal evidence. Partial accountability mixed with blame shifting. I know I hurt you, but you also. They can't own their behavior without deflecting. Boundary testing disguised as working on communication. They use therapy language to push past your limits. Love bombing and intensity instead of consistency. Grand gestures rather than steady, reliable change. Needing you as motivation or audience for their growth. Their transformation depends on your participation. Explanations and promises instead of demonstrated patterns. They tell you they've changed rather than showing you over time. Here's the litmus test Jung would want you to apply. Are they doing the work regardless of whether you're watching? Or does their transformation require your audience, your forgiveness, your participation? Real healing is an inside job. If their healing depends on your involvement, it's not healing, it's another form of control. We're coming to the end of our time together, and I want to leave you with the deepest truth that Carl Jung offered about this journey. Jung was fascinated by medieval alchemy, not because he believed in literal transformation of lead into gold, but because he saw it as a metaphor for psychological transformation. The alchemists described a process that moved through distinct stages, and Jung recognized these stages in the individuation journey. First comes nigredo, the blackening, the death phase. This is the dark night of the soul when you finally see the relationship for what it truly is. When the illusions shatter and you're left with raw, painful truth. If you've been through this, you know how it feels. Like everything you believed was a lie. Like you can't trust your own perception. Like the ground beneath you has disappeared. Then comes albedo, the whitening, the purification phase. This is when you create distance, when you begin grieving, when you start cleansing yourself of the toxicity you've absorbed. This phase feels empty, lonely. You're in the liminal space between who you were and who you're becoming. Next comes citrinitas, the yellowing, the awakening phase. This is when your own light starts returning, when you begin to feel your own energy again, when you start to remember who you were before this relationship, and more importantly, who you're becoming beyond it. Finally comes rubedo, the reddening, the integration phase. This is wholeness. This is when you contain all aspects of yourself, light and shadow, strength and vulnerability, compassion and boundaries. This is sovereign empathy. Right now, if you're experiencing their final manipulation, you're probably in the vulnerable space between albedo and citrinitas. You've done the hard work of separation and you're starting to feel your own strength return. But you're not fully stable in it yet. And that's exactly when they strike with manufactured vulnerability, with strength shaming, with nostalgic manipulation. This final manipulation is a test. Not a test they're consciously administering, but a test nonetheless. Will you return to nigredo, to the darkness, to the illusion? Or will you continue toward rubedo, toward your wholeness, your integration, your sovereign empathy? I want to give you the permission I suspect you've been waiting for. Permission you may not have received from family, from friends, from a culture that tells you that empathy means endless accommodation, and that being a good person means perpetual availability, that loving someone means tolerating anything. You are permitted to heal, not someday when they're ready, not after you've tried one more time, not when you've proven you gave it your all. Right now, today, this moment, you are permitted to choose healing. You are permitted to protect your energy, to recognize that your vitality, your life force, your inner light is not an unlimited resource to be extracted by whoever demands it. Your energy is sacred and you are its guardian. You are permitted to love someone from a distance. to hold space for their humanity while not allowing them proximity to harm you. Distance isn't hate sometimes. Distance is the most honest form of love you can offer when closeness has become toxic. You are permitted to close doors that keep reopening, to lock them, to walk away even when they're knocking, to understand that some doors were never meant to stay open, and that closing them isn't cruelty, it's wisdom earned through painful experience. You are permitted to disappoint someone who needs you to stay small, to outgrow relationships that require your diminishment, to understand that people who truly love you celebrate your expansion, while those who need to control you will always find fault with your growth. You are permitted to feel compassion without sacrificing yourself, to witness suffering without believing you must absorb it, to care deeply without carrying what isn't yours to carry. Compassion and self-abandonment are not synonyms, though you may have been taught they were. You are permitted to become whole, not perfect, not invulnerable, not without pain or mistakes or ongoing growth, but whole, integrated, boundaried, centered in your own authority. Whole in a way that includes both your empathy and your sovereignty. Your empathy was never the problem. Let me say that again, because you need to hear it. Your empathy was never the problem. Your capacity to feel, to sense, to intuit, to connect. This is a profound gift. This is what makes you extraordinary. Unconscious empathy, empathy without boundaries, empathy that requires self-abandonment, empathy that mistakes feeling everything for fixing everything that was the trap. That's the pattern you're breaking. Conscious empathy, empathy paired with discernment, empathy rooted in a strong sense of self-empathy that flows from fullness rather than depletion, that's your superpower. That's what you're becoming. You can feel deeply and honor yourself. These aren't mutually exclusive. You can sense others' pain and not abandon your center. You're compassionate and boundaried, soft and strong, open and protected. These aren't contradictions. This is integration. This is maturity. This is wholeness. This is what Jung called individuation, becoming fully, authentically yourself. The narcissist sees your strength and panics, because at some unconscious level they recognize what you're becoming, someone who cannot be controlled because you found your center. Someone who cannot be manipulated because you trust your own perception. Someone who cannot be diminished because you know your worth. Someone who feels deeply but doesn't lose herself in those feelings. Who can swim in emotional waters without drowning? Who can hold space for complexity without being consumed by it? Someone who loves generously but doesn't betray herself to prove it. Who understands that real love includes self-love. That authentic generosity flows from abundance, not depletion. Someone who empathizes authentically but doesn't rescue compulsively. Who can distinguish between supporting someone's growth and enabling their dysfunction. Who knows the difference between helping and hurting in the guise of helping. You're becoming what I call a sovereign empath. Someone who has integrated both the feeling function that Jung described and the thinking function that provides discernment. Someone who honors both heart and head. Someone who has done the shadow work to reclaim healthy selfishness, righteous anger, and the sacred no. And that terrifies them. Not consciously, perhaps, but at a deep, unconscious level, your wholeness is their mirror. It reflects their own unlived potential. It shows them what's possible when someone chooses authenticity over approval, vulnerability over victim identity, growth over control. It reminds them that they too could do this work, this painful, liberating work of shadow integration, of facing their wounds rather than projecting them, of building a self from the inside out rather than constructing a persona propped up by others' energy. But they've chosen a different path. And that's not your responsibility. That's not your failure. That's not your problem to solve. Let them panic. Let them manipulate. Let them deploy every trick in their psychological arsenal. You just keep choosing yourself. Not from cruelty, but from love. Not from vengeance, but from wisdom. Not from hardness, but from the kind of radical self-compassion that understands you cannot pour from an empty cup, you cannot heal what you didn't break, you cannot save anyone from themselves. Deep, abiding love for the self you're finally meeting after all these years of abandoning her for others. Love for the tender inner child who learned to disappear her needs. Love for the exhausted adult who carried everyone's emotions. Love for the emerging sovereign being who is learning finally to come home to herself. Carl Jung said that the narcissist's desperate need to control you is actually evidence of your freedom. Sit with that paradox for a moment. Their manipulation isn't proof of their power. It's proof of their panic. It's proof of their fear. It's proof that you've already changed in fundamental ways that threaten their entire psychological structure. If you were still controllable, they wouldn't need to manipulate. If you were still available for exploitation, they wouldn't need to manufacture crisis. If you were still operating from that wounded place of self-abandonment, they wouldn't need to deploy these final tricks. The very fact that they're trying so hard is evidence that something essential has shifted in you. You've found your center. You've reconnected with yourself. You've remembered your worth. Your strength reminds them of their own potential for growth, potential they've abandoned in favor of control and manipulation. Potential that still exists, but remains unlived, buried beneath layers of defense mechanisms and projected shadow. When you refuse to shrink, when you maintain your boundaries, despite their manufactured crisis. When you stand in your truth, even when they call it coldness, you're not just protecting yourself. You're offering them a gift they may never accept, the vision of another way of being. You're showing them what's possible when someone chooses the difficult path of authenticity over the easy path of ego inflation. When someone does the painstaking work of shadow integration instead of shadow projection. When someone builds an identity rooted in truth rather than constructed from others' validation. They may never take that path themselves. Probably won't, if we're honest. That's not your responsibility. You can't want their growth more than they want it. You can't do their individuation work for them. You can't save them from themselves, no matter how much your empathic heart wants to believe you can. But by taking that path yourself, you become living proof that it exists. You become evidence that healing is possible, that wholeness is achievable, that sovereign empathy is real. And here's what I want you to remember on the hard days when doubt creeps in, when you wonder if you're being too harsh or too rigid or too unforgiving. Every time you choose yourself, you're choosing life. Every time you maintain your boundary despite their crisis, you're maintaining your integrity. Every time you say no when your old pattern would have said yes, you're saying yes to your authentic self. You're not being selfish. You're completing a sacred task that Jung called individuation. You're not being cold. You're being boundaried. You're not being harsh. You're being honest. You're becoming who you truly are beneath all the conditioning and accommodation and self-abandonment. That self you've been searching for, she's been waiting. She's been there all along beneath the layers of should and must and have to. Beneath the good girl conditioning and the people-pleasing patterns and the compulsive caretaking. She's stronger than you remember, wiser than you knew, more compassionate than you feared she might be once you found your boundaries. Because real compassion, conscious boundaried compassion, is stronger than unconscious, unlimited accommodation ever was. And she's ready. Ready to live fully, ready to love authentically, ready to feel deeply without losing herself, ready to take up space without apology, ready to disappoint people who need her small, ready to become whole. The narcissist's final trick only works if you forget who you are. But you won't forget. Not anymore. Because now you see it. Now you understand the mechanism. Now you recognize the pattern. Now you see how strength shaming tries to make you ashamed of your healing. Now you understand how nostalgic manipulation tries to make you homesick for your cage. Now you recognize how manufactured vulnerability tries to weaponize your compassion against your sovereignty. And seeing it, understanding it, recognizing it, that's freedom. Your healing isn't selfish. Let that land. Your healing isn't selfish. It's the most generous thing you can do for yourself, yes, absolutely. But also for a world that desperately needs awakened empaths, not depleted ones. The world needs people who can feel deeply without losing themselves, who can hold space for pain without absorbing it, who can love generously without self-betrayal, who can extend compassion without enabling dysfunction. The world needs people like you, fully individuated, fully sovereign, fully empathic, and fully whole. Not empaths who give until there's nothing left, but empaths who give from overflow, who love from fullness, who serve from strength. This is your journey, not theirs. Yours. This is your transformation, earned through every boundary you've set, every difficult conversation you've had, every time you've chosen yourself when everything in you wanted to choose them instead. This is you becoming complete. Not perfect. Completion isn't perfection. It's integration. It's holding all your parts, light and shadow, strength and vulnerability, compassion and discernment, in conscious relationship with each other. And no manufactured crisis, no matter how convincing, no matter how real the pain, no matter how guilty you feel, is worth trading that wholeness away. Nothing is worth abandoning yourself again. Nothing. You've come too far. You've done too much work. You've reclaimed too much of yourself to give it back now. Welcome home to yourself. To the self who was always there waiting. To the self who is strong and soft, boundaried and open, wise and still learning. To the self who can love without losing, who can feel without drowning, who can give without depleting. Welcome home to your sovereignty, to your power, to your sacred, beautiful, hard-won wholeness. This is who you are now. And no one, no matter how they manipulate, no matter how they cry crisis, no matter how they try to pull you back, can take that away from you unless you give it away. And you won't. Not anymore. Because you remember now. You remember who you are. If this resonated with you, if you felt seen and understood in these words, know that you're not alone. Thousands of empaths are walking this same path right now, the path from unconscious accommodation to sovereign compassion. The path Carl Jung called individuation. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. What part of this hit home for you? Was it the strength shaming, the nostalgic manipulation, the manufactured vulnerability? Share your experience. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today, to know they're not crazy, they're not cold, they're not alone. And if you want to continue this journey of Carl Jung empath and personal development wisdom, subscribe to this channel. We're building a community of people who refuse to choose between their empathy and their sovereignty. People who understand that true compassion includes self-compassion. People who know that wholeness isn't selfishness. It's the whole point. Thank you for spending this time with me. Thank you for doing this difficult, sacred work of becoming who you truly are. The world needs your light, but it needs you whole and healed, not depleted and diminished. Remember, your empathy is your superpower. Your boundaries are your self-respect. Your healing is your sacred rebellion. Keep choosing yourself. Keep becoming whole. Keep trusting that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Until next time, take care of that precious self you're finally meeting.